January 27, 1945. A grey sky hangs low over southern Poland. Snow drifts across broken barbed wire. Soviet soldiers from the 322nd Rifle Division move carefully through the gates of Auschwitz concentration camp. They were not prepared for what they would see. Watchtowers stand silent. Guard dogs are gone. The SS has fled. But inside the barracks, behind layers of frost and filth, thousands of survivors remain, skeletal, hollow-eyed, wrapped in striped uniforms that barely cling to their bodies. A Soviet war photographer lifts his camera. The shutter clicks. The image will circle the world. It will become proof of industrialized murder, proof of what official reports once dismissed as exaggeration, proof that the war was not only fought with tanks and artillery, but with ideology and annihilation. This is only one photograph. There are hundreds more, images buried in archives, locked in personal trunks, suppressed in state vaults, photographs that government forgotten, tried to hide. Soviet troops entered Auschwitz in January 1945. The Second World War had already consumed 6 years of human history. It began on September 1, 1939. German forces crossed into Poland under the orders of Adolf Hitler. Within weeks, Poland was divided between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Europe fell into a pattern of occupation, collaboration, resistance, and silence. War at first looked conventional: armoured columns, aerial bombardment, naval blockades. The blitzkrieg campaigns in Poland, Norway, France, and the Low Countries were swift and overwhelming. By June 1940, France had fallen. Britain stood alone. But beneath the movement of armies, something else was forming. The Nazi regime had long framed its war as ideological. Jews, Roma, political opponents, Slavic populations, these were not seen as enemies in uniform but as racial threats. Early policies focused on segregation and forced relocation. Ghettos were established in Warsaw, Lodz, and dozens of other occupied cities. Starvation was policy. Disease spread quickly behind sealed walls. Then came June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Germany invaded the Soviet Union with over 3 million troops. Behind the front lines followed Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing units. They executed civilians in forests and ravines. One of the most infamous massacres occurred at Babi Yar near Kiev, where more than 33,000 Jews were murdered in 2 days. The killings were systematic, documented, photographed, but mass shootings created logistical and psychological strain for the perpetrators. Nazi leadership began searching for methods that were more industrial, more efficient. By late 1941, extermination camps were constructed or expanded in occupied Poland. Cholomno, Belzec, Sobibor, Treblinka, and Auschwitz, originally established in 1940 as a concentration camp for Polish political prisoners, evolved into something far larger. Auschwitz-Birkenau became the centre of what the Nazis called the final solution. Gas chambers were built. Crematoria operated day and night. Deportation trains arrived from across Europe: France, Hungary, Greece, the Netherlands, Italy. Between 1942 and 1944, the machinery of death operated at unprecedented scale. Historians estimate that approximately 1.1 million people were murdered at Auschwitz alone, the vast majority of them Jewish. And yet, much of this remained obscured during the war. Information did leak. The Polish resistance smuggled reports to London. In 1944, 2 Slovak Jewish prisoners, Rudolf Vierbier and Alfred Wetzler, escaped Auschwitz and provided detailed testimony about the gas chambers and crematoria. Their reports circulated among Allied leaders, but military priorities focused on defeating Germany's armed forces. The camps were not bombed. The rail lines remained intact. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda carefully curated imagery. Photographs released to the German public showed orderly camps, productive labour, smiling children in occupied territories. A false reality. Even inside the camps, photography was controlled. Arst personnel documented arrivals, selections, and property confiscation. Some images were taken by prisoners forced to work in photography units. A handful of clandestine photos were smuggled out, blurry images of cremation pits at Birkenau. Risking immediate execution, photography had become a weapon. It could sanitize, or it could expose, or it could expose. As 1944 progressed, The military situation shifted dramatically. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The Western Front reopened. In the east, the Red Army pushed relentlessly through Belarus and Poland. German forces retreated. By late 1944, it was clear the Third Reich was collapsing. Orders were issued to dismantle evidence. Documents were burned. Gas chambers at Auschwitz were partially destroyed. Prisoners were forced on death marches westward in brutal winter conditions. Thousands died along the roads. The regime attempted to erase its crimes before the world could see them. But cameras were ready waiting, because wherever armies advanced, photographers followed. Soviet, American, British. Some were official military correspondents. Others were independent journalists. Their task was not only to document victory, but to record what had been hidden. And what they would capture in 1945 would redefine how the war was understood, not simply as a conflict of nations, but as a confrontation with systematic genocide. The liberation of camps was not the beginning of these crimes. It was the moment the evidence became undeniable. And that evidence would travel far beyond Poland. When Allied forces crossed into Germany in early 1945, they did not yet understand the full scale of what they were about to uncover. The Western Allies had already witnessed destruction on a continental scale. Cities like Hamburg and Dresden lay in ruins from aerial bombardment. Millions were displaced. Front lines shifted daily, but the concentration camps were still, in many cases, rumours layered over intelligence reports. That changed in April 1945. On April 11, American troops from the 6th Armoured Division reached Buchenwald concentration camp near Weimar. Days later, British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The scenes were overwhelming. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, piles of corpses unburied. Typhus rampant. American General Dwight D. Eisenhower visited Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, on April 12. He insisted that members of Congress and journalists witness the evidence firsthand. He understood something critical. If documented clearly, the images could never be dismissed as wartime exaggeration. Military photographers moved carefully through the camps. They photographed barracks stacked with bodies, storehouses filled with shoes, hair, eyeglasses, confiscated from victims. Crematoria ovens, gas chambers, survivors staring directly into the lens. Some of these images were published almost immediately, others were archived, classified, held back due to their graphic nature or political sensitivity. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. In the Pacific, fighting continued until Japan's surrender in September. But as the war closed, another battle began, one over memory. The photographs taken in 1945 would serve as evidence during the Nuremberg trials. Prosecutors projected images of liberated camps onto courtroom walls. Defendants could not deny what the cameras had captured. And yet, the photographs consciousness equally. Images were too distinct, conflicted with political narratives. Emerging former enemies became strategic partners. The Soviet Union and Western Allies drifted into rivalry. Documentation from Soviet archives was often dismissed or inaccessible in the West. Western atrocities, such as the firebombing of cities, were discussed less prominently. Photography became entangled in geopolitics. In Eastern Europe, communist governments curated their own versions of liberation imagery, emphasizing Red Army heroism while minimizing certain complexities, including the specific targeting of Jewish victims. In the West, media sometimes generalized camp victims as political prisoners rather than acknowledging the centrality of the Holocaust. Images that complicated clean narratives were sidelined. Photographs of collaboration in occupied countries. French officials shaking hands with German officers. Civilians looting Jewish property. Crowds attending public humiliations of women accused of relationships with German soldiers. These were uncomfortable realities. There were also images that challenged simple moral divisions. German civilians forced to tour nearby camps, their faces registering shock or denial. Photographs of Allied soldiers reacting with visible horror. Even execution sites of Nazi officials after summary trials. History prefers clarity. Photographs often provide ambiguity. Over time, only a fraction of wartime imagery became iconic. The raising of the Soviet flag over the Reichstag. The liberation scenes at Auschwitz. Celebrations in London and New York. These images shaped collective memory. But tens of thousands of other photographs remained in archives, stored in boxes labelled by date and location. Filed under military reports, preserved in private collections, they reveal lesser-known perspectives. Jewish partisans in the forests of Eastern Europe. Soviet prisoners of war in German captivity, many of whom perished in staggering numbers. African-American soldiers serving in segregated units within the US Army. Asian forced labourers under Japanese occupation. Civilians caught between shifting front lines. The Second World War was not only fought on battlefields. It was experienced in kitchens, railway stations, factories, ghettos, forests and camps. Each photograph freezes a single second of that vast human experience. But what was chosen for publication, and what was withheld, shaped how generations understood the conflict. Now, decades later, as archives declassify materials and historians revisit neglected collections, forgotten images resurface. They do not rewrite history, they deepen it. Because what was hidden was not always erased. It was waiting. War photographers were not neutral machines. They were soldiers, civilians, journalists, men and women carrying cameras instead of rifles. Some worked for governments, others for newspapers. Many were embedded with advancing armies. When American photographer Margaret Burke-White entered Buchenwald concentration camp in April 1945, she later wrote that the smell was unforgettable. She forced herself to keep shooting, frame after frame. Survivors pressed against barbed wire, corpses stacked in open cuts. The camera did not flinch, but the person holding it often did. Soviet photographers who entered Auschwitz concentration camp faced similar moments. They recorded orphan children staring into the lens, women wrapped in blankets, their faces both vacant and alert. These photographers understood the stakes. If they failed to document, denial would follow, and denial did follow. In the months and years after the war, some questioned the authenticity of certain images. Propaganda accusations surfaced. Staged scenes were alleged. That is why commanders like Dwight D. Eisenhower insisted on wide documentation, multiple witnesses, multiple cameras, film reels preserved under military custody. The human angle is not only about those photographed. It is about those who chose to press the shutter at the exact second history demanded proof. Because without them, much of what happened behind barbed wire would have remained testimony without image, and testimony alone is often easier to dismiss. But the human dimension extends further. Many survivors later described their first awareness of being photographed during liberation. Some straightened their posture, some hid their faces, some wanted the world to see, others felt exposed. The image becomes both evidence and intrusion. A photograph can immortalize suffering, but it cannot ask permission. That moral tension sits quietly in every frame taken during those final months of the war, and it leads directly to another perspective. The tactical one. Photographs were not only historical records, they were strategic instruments. When Allied troops discovered camps in 1945, High Command immediately recognized the propaganda implications. The images would justify the war effort to domestic audiences. They would reinforce the necessity of unconditional surrender. General Eisenhower reportedly told visiting journalists and politicians that they must see the camps for themselves, so that no one could later claim exaggeration. In Britain, newsreels showing scenes from Bergen-Belsen were screened in cinemas. In the United States, newspapers printed graphic images rarely seen before in mainstream media. The visual shock unified public opinion in a war-weary society. But photography had served strategy long before liberation. Nazi Germany used imagery extensively. Official photographers captured carefully composed scenes of strength, marches at Nuremberg rallies, disciplined formations of the Wehrmacht, images of Adolf Hitler surrounded by adoring crowds. The illusion of unity was curated frame by frame. Meanwhile, darker operations were photographed internally for documentation, inventory, or bureaucratic efficiency. Albums compiled by SS officers recorded deportations and selections at camps. Some of these albums were later recovered by survivors. These were not meant for public consumption. They were administrative records of atrocity. In the Soviet Union, wartime photography also emphasized heroism, Red Army soldiers raising flags, civilians greeting liberators. Certain complexities were filtered out to maintain a cohesive narrative of victory. Every government understood something fundamental. Images shape memory faster than reports do. A single photograph can outlive volumes of written testimony. That is why rail yards filled with deportation trains were sometimes photographed from specific angles. Why destroyed cities were framed to highlight enemy aggression. Why certain casualties were shown and others not. The battlefield extended into newspapers and film reels. And by 1945, when the gates of camps were opened, the camera became a weapon of a different kind, one aimed at the future. Because whoever controlled the image would influence how the war would be remembered, photographs of perpetrators are among the most unsettling images of the war. Some show uniformed SS officers standing beside barbed wire. Others capture ordinary German civilians walking past camp fences, their expressions unreadable. In 1945, Allied photographers documented townspeople from Weimar being escorted through Buchenwald concentration camp. They were shown mass graves, crematoria, evidence that had existed only kilometers from their homes. The images are complex. Some civilians appear horrified. Others look distant. A few seem defensive. Photographs cannot explain what individuals knew or chose not to know, but they force the confrontation. There are also internal German photographs recovered after the war. Albums compiled by SS personnel at Auschwitz concentration camp documented arrivals of Hungarian Jews in 1944, women and children stepping off trains, selections conducted by officers. The camera, in these cases, was not condemning. It was administrative, routine. That banality is chilling. It suggests that genocide was not hidden chaos. It was structured, recorded, filed. These images complicate the post-war narrative that responsibility belonged only to a small circle of leaders. They reveal systems, layers of participation, and they remind us that photographs can indict not only individuals, but society's World War II is often remembered through certain iconic images: Normandy beaches, Soviet flags over Berlin, celebrations in Times Square. But beyond these familiar frames were entire theatres of suffering that received far less visual attention. In the East, millions of Soviet prisoners of war died in German captivity. Starvation was policy. Camps were overcrowded. Disease spread unchecked. Photographs of skeletal Soviet power exist, but for decades they remained less circulated in Western discourse. In Asia, Imperial Japan's expansion left its own trail of atrocity. The 1937 massacre in Nanjing was documented in part by foreign observers and even some Japanese soldiers. Photographs show civilians executed along riverbanks, entire neighborhoods destroyed. Yet for years after the war, global awareness fluctuated, shaped by post-war alliances and regional politics. In North Africa, colonial troops from across the French Empire fought in brutal desert campaigns. African soldiers in Allied uniforms were photographed advancing through Italy and southern France. Their contributions were vital, yet often marginalized in post-war visual narratives. African American soldiers served in segregated units within the US Army. Images show them loading supplies, building airstrips, manning artillery. In some rare photographs they appear guarding German prisoners of war, an inversion of racial hierarchies that contradicted segregation at home. There were also Jewish partisan fighters operating in forests of Belarus and Lithuania. Armed resistance existed, though it is less frequently depicted than victimization. Photographs show young men and women holding rifles, standing beside makeshift bunkers deep in woodland terrain. Each of these fronts carried its own story, yet collective memory often compresses complexity into a simplified narrative. Axis versus Allies, evil versus good. The forgotten photographs resist compression. They show hunger in Leningrad during the siege. They show forced labourers repairing bombed infrastructure in occupied Europe. They show displaced families walking endless roads after borders shifted. They expand the war beyond decisive battles and famous generals, and in doing so, they raise a deeper question. If so much was documented, if cameras were present in ghettos, forests, deserts, factories and camps, why did some images become universal symbols while others faded into obscurity? The answer lies not only in what happened during the war, but in what happened after it ended. Because the decisive turning point was not merely military victory. It was the moment when images moved from battlefield evidence to historical judgment, April 1945. The Third Reich is collapsing from every direction. Soviet forces close in on Berlin. American and British armies cross the Rhine. Cities burn. Communications fracture. Inside Germany's borders, camps are being evacuated. Prisoners are forced westward on foot. Guards destroy files. Crematoria are blown apart in hurried attempts to erase evidence. But the erasure is incomplete. On April 4, 1945, American troops reach Ogerodruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald. What they discover shocks even hardened combat veterans. Bodies lie in open pits. Others are scattered near rail tracks. Survivors, barely able to stand, describe executions carried out only days before liberation. General Dwight D. Eisenhower visits soon after. He walks through the grounds. He sees the ovens, the burial trenches. He orders extensive filming and photography, not for propaganda alone, but for record. He anticipates a future in which these crimes might be denied. On April 11, resistance within Buchenwald concentration camp seizes control moments before American troops arrive. Cameras document armed prisoners standing beside captured guards. The image reverses power. 4 days later, on April 15, British forces enter Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. The scene is catastrophic. Approximately 60,000 prisoners are inside. Thousands of corpses lie unburied. Disease spreads rapidly. British Army film and photographic unit teams begin documenting immediately. Bulldozers push mass graves. German civilians from nearby towns are compelled to assist in burials. The footage is stark, unedited, and in the east, Soviet troops had already entered Auschwitz concentration camp on January 27. They found around 7,000 prisoners left behind, too weak to march. Warehouses filled with human hair, suitcases labelled with names and addresses, children's clothing sorted in piles. Soviet cameramen captured survivors wrapped in blankets, staring silently at the lens. Some footage was later used in war crime trials. Some remained within Soviet archives for decades. By late April, as Berlin falls and Adolf Hitler dies by suicide on April 30, the military war effectively ends. But the photographic record intensifies. Images from liberated camps begin appearing in newspapers across Europe and North America. Headlines speak of horror beyond imagination. Civilians who had followed war maps for 6 years are now confronted with something different. Systematic extermination. The moral dimension of the war shifts. It is no longer only about territorial aggression or political ideology. It becomes about genocide made visible. Then comes November 20, 1945. The International Military Tribunal opens in Nuremberg. Prosecutors introduce film footage and photographic evidence from the camps. The courtroom darkens. Projectors hum. Images fill the walls. Defendants sit in silence. The evidence is not hearsay, it is visual. Stacks of corpses, starving prisoners, gas chambers. The photographs transform the trial. They bypass language barriers. They bypass denial. They confront the accused and the world with documented reality. For the first time in history, war crimes are prosecuted using modern visual media as central evidence. This is the turning point. Not merely the defeat of Nazi Germany, but the global acknowledgement of crimes against humanity, preserved on film. And yet, even in this moment of exposure, selection is already underway. Which photographs are shown publicly, which are archived, which are considered too disturbing, too politically sensitive, too destabilizing. The climax of revelation carries within it the seeds of future silence. The courtroom in Nuremberg is heavy with silence. November 29, 1945. American prosecutor Thomas Dodd introduces a compilation film assembled from footage shot during the liberation of camps. The lights dim, the projector flickers. On the screen appear scenes from Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. Bodies stacked like timber, survivors moving slowly between barracks, British soldiers covering their mouths against the stench. Then footage from Buchenwald concentration camp, tattooed arms. Crematoria interiors, emaciated prisoners looking directly at the camera. The defendants cannot look away. For years, the Nazi regime had controlled imagery within Germany. Rallies at Nuremberg were staged for grandeur. Parades were filmed with sweeping camera angles. Photographs of Adolf Hitler were composed to project calm authority and destiny. Now the same medium exposes the regime's machinery of death. The tribunal establishes a precedent. Photographic evidence is admissible proof of systematic crime. But outside the courtroom, the political world is already shifting. In 1946 and 1947, tensions between the former Allies intensify. The Iron Curtain descends across Europe. Western powers and the Soviet Union enter a period of distrust. The Cold War reshapes memory. Some Soviet liberation footage is viewed skeptically in the West, dismissed by critics as exaggerated or staged, even when corroborated by independent sources. Conversely, Soviet authorities control their own narrative tightly, emphasizing Red Army heroism while limiting broader discussion of specific victim groups. In Western Europe, reconstruction begins. Germany is divided into occupation zones. The immediate priority becomes stability. Photographs that implicate broad segments of society and complicity are politically sensitive. Images of German civilians looting Jewish property, photographs of local collaborators assisting deportations. These exist, but they are not always foregrounded in post-war discourse. There is also fatigue. By 1946, newspapers reduced the frequency of camp imagery. Audiences, overwhelmed by years of war reporting, begin to turn toward rebuilding stories. The Marshall Plan, elections, new constitutions. The photographs do not disappear. They are archived, filed in military records. Stored in national archives, preserved by survivors, but public attention narrows. At the same time, other atrocities receive uneven coverage. Documentation of the 1937 massacre in Nanjing circulates within Asia and among historians, but global recognition fluctuates depending on diplomatic relations in the Pacific. Images from Japanese prisoner of war camps are shown during the Tokyo trials, yet later fade from mainstream Western narratives focused primarily on Europe. In Eastern Europe, photographs of anti-Soviet resistance movements are suppressed under communist regimes. Partisan fighters who resisted both Nazis and later Soviet control are removed from official imagery. Every emerging state constructs a usable past. Photographs that strengthen national unity are elevated. Those that complicate identity are minimized. Meanwhile, Holocaust survivors begin rebuilding their lives in displaced persons camps across Germany, Austria, and Italy. Photographers capture weddings in barracks, children attending improvised schools, Jewish refugees boarding ships bound for Palestine. These images tell a different story, not only of death but of continuity, yet they compete for space in a world focused on geopolitical tension. By the 1950s, the war's visual archive is vast. Millions of photographs exist across continents. But only a limited selection shapes textbooks and public consciousness. The turning point, then, is not singular. It is layered. First, the moment of discovery, when cameras record undeniable evidence of genocide. Second, the courtroom, where those images transform into legal proof. Third, the political reshaping of memory, where selection determines legacy. History is not hidden because there are no photographs. It is hidden because photographs can be set aside. And yet, they remain. Negatives preserved in climate-controlled vaults. Albums passed down through families. Almato. Contact sheets stored in forgotten drawers. Waiting for rediscovery. May 1945. Germany lies in ruins. Berlin is divided into sectors controlled by the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, and France. Millions are displaced. Rail networks are shattered. Entire cities exist as skeletal frameworks of stone and ash. But beyond physical destruction, another reckoning unfolds, the reckoning with evidence. The photographs taken during liberation are catalogued by military authorities. In Washington, London, and Moscow, film reels are archived under classified designations. Still images are labelled by date, unit, and location. They become part of official war records. The Nuremberg trials continue until October 1946. 12 leading Nazi officials are sentenced to death. Others receive prison terms. Photographic evidence remains central throughout the proceedings. It establishes a precedent. Crimes against humanity can be proven through documented imagery. Yet justice is incomplete. Thousands of lower-ranking officials return to civilian life. Many claim ignorance. Some genuinely insist they did not know the scale of extermination. Photographs that show deportation trains passing through towns or forced labour near city centres challenge those claims. But confronting that reality requires sustained public attention. In the immediate post-war years, attention is fragmented. The Cold War intensifies. In 1947, the Truman Doctrine signals American commitment to containing Soviet expansion. By 1949, West Germany is established as the Federal Republic of Germany. East Germany becomes the German Democratic Republic. Former enemies are now strategic partners or ideological adversaries. Within West Germany, denazification efforts begin but are uneven. Some war criminals are prosecuted. Others are reintegrated into administrative roles to maintain stability. Public discussion of complicity is cautious. Photographs that expose widespread participation are not always prominently displayed. In East Germany, the state narrative emphasizes anti-fascist resistance. Responsibility is framed as belonging to capitalist elites and Western imperialists. The broader societal dimension receives less attention. Memory becomes ideological terrain. Meanwhile, survivors testify. Holocaust survivors publish memoirs. Jewish organizations document testimonies. Personal photographs, family portraits taken before deportation, become silent witnesses to communities erased. But public consciousness evolves slowly. In the 1950s, many European societies prioritized reconstruction over reflection. Economic recovery becomes central. Images of bombed cities being rebuilt dominate newspapers more than camp photographs. In 1961, the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem reintroduces the visual record to a global audience. Though Eichmann's crimes were bureaucratic rather than directly photographed in action, documentary footage and survivor testimony once again project camp imagery into public view. The trial is televised internationally, reinforcing the historical record. Yet even then, countless images remain underutilized. Photographs of collaboration in occupied France. Images of Baltic auxiliary units assisting German forces. Documentation of local pogroms in Eastern Europe. These exist within archives but do not always fit clean national narratives. There are also Allied images that complicate moral clarity. Photographs of the firebombing aftermath in Dresden. Civilian casualties in Tokyo after incendiary raids, the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These images exist alongside camp liberation photos, yet they occupy different moral categories in public discourse. War photography does not arrange itself into simple binaries. In the Soviet Union, wartime photographs are integrated into a grand narrative of the Great Patriotic War. Heroism dominates. Suffering is acknowledged but often collectivized rather than individualized. Jewish victimhood is subsumed into broader Soviet loss. In the United States and Britain, liberation imagery becomes part of the justification for post-war leadership in international institutions such as the United Nations. The phrase never again enters political vocabulary, shaped heavily by photographic memory. And yet genocides and atrocities continue in later decades. Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia. Each time journalists invoke the visual archive of World War II as warning, Bonkurzen. The aftermath of those 1945 photographs is not only legal or political, it is moral. Political, it is moral. They redefine what the world understands as possible. Industrialized murder is no longer theoretical. It has a visual record. But even as the images circulate, something quieter happens. They begin to fade from daily awareness. Not erased, but absorbed into textbooks, museums and memorial ceremonies, viewed periodically rather than urgently. And still, beyond the well-known frames, thousands of lesser-seen photographs remain in storage. Their stories are unfinished. By the late 20th century, the war had shifted from lived memory to historical study. Veterans aged. Survivors passed away. Archives expanded. Governments began declassifying wartime collections. Institutions digitized negatives once accessible only to researchers with special clearance. What had been locked in temperature-controlled vaults slowly entered public databases. In Germany, a generational shift during the 1960s and 1970s transformed the national conversation. Younger Germans questioned their parents' roles during the Third Reich. University students demanded transparency. Photographs resurfaced in exhibitions, images of deportations passing through ordinary streets, of neighbours watching Jewish families being forced onto trucks. The camera returned to the centre of accountability. Museums such as the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and Yad Vashem curated expansive photographic archives. Context was added, names were restored to faces where possible, images once labelled only by location gained personal identities. Yet even in the age of memorialization, selection continued. Certain photographs became emblematic. The skeletal survivors behind barbed wire at Buchenwald concentration camp. The children wrapped in blankets at Auschwitz concentration camp. These frames crystallized collective understanding of genocide. But what of the images taken before extermination? Photographs of Jewish communities in Warsaw before the war, crowded markets, schools, weddings. Images of Roma families travelling across Eastern Europe. Portraits of disabled Germans targeted under the T4 euthanasia programme. These pictures reveal lives in motion before interruption. Their absence from early post-war narratives shaped perception. There were also the photographs taken by perpetrators themselves, private albums found in attics decades later. In some cases, families of former SS officers discovered collections that included images from camps or executions. These discoveries forced renewed public debate. How does a nation confront images preserved not as evidence, but as souvenirs? Meanwhile, the Soviet archives began opening more fully after 1991, following the collapse of the Soviet Union. Previously inaccessible footage from Eastern Front liberations and mass graves became available to international scholars. Some scenes corroborated Western documentation. Others expanded it, revealing lesser-known massacre sites across Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states. The globalization of memory accelerated. Digital platforms allowed historians, journalists, and independent researchers to cross-reference images across continents. A photograph labelled simply a Poland, 1944, could be matched to railway timetables, deportation records, or survivor testimony. Technology reshaped interpretation, but it also introduced new challenges. Images detached from context can be misused. Cropped photographs circulate online without explanation. Visual evidence can be distorted or weaponized in contemporary political arguments. The responsibility of interpretation becomes as critical as the act of preservation. And still, some photographs remain largely unseen. Images documenting forced labour by Soviet POW in rural Germany. Photographs of Asian forced labourers under Japanese occupation. Scenes from partisan operations in forests, rarely included in mainstream textbooks. These are not hidden because they are secret. They are hidden because history has limited bandwidth. Collective memory selects symbols. The raised flag over Berlin. The VE Day kiss in Times Square. The liberation of camps. Yet between those iconic frames lies an immense visual landscape. Ordinary suffering, quiet resistance, moral compromise. In recent decades, historians have increasingly emphasized complexity over simplification. Exhibitions now juxtapose perpetrator photographs with victim testimony. They include bystander imagery alongside battlefield heroics. The aim is not to dilute responsibility, but to broaden understanding. Because the Second World War was not experienced only by generals and dictators.